Here in Area 10, we begin to turn our attention to events and movements, particularly in the 20th century. Much of what we've talked about so far, the great missionary century, was happening in the 1800s, and so now we're sort of bridging the gap and beginning to see some things happening in the 1900s as well. Well, here in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the missionary impulse was really high, especially here in the United States. Still a little bit in Great Britain and in other parts of Europe, but especially here in the United States. Our country had survived the devastating effects of the Civil War, and a new time of peace and prosperity had dawned in our country. And it was also a time of significant church growth and optimism within the life of the church. New advances in technology made it easier and safer to travel and reach the ends of the earth. And as churches began thinking about the missionary calling and our call to go to the ends of the earth, suddenly that was easier to do than it had ever been before. And that also helped to spark and to fuel the missionary impulse that was present at the time. Now, some of those who were most affected by the optimism of the age were college students. And in this section of Tucker, you will be reading about some of the major figures of the student volunteer movement, as it was called, sometimes abbreviated SVM, Student Volunteer Movement. Generally, this movement refers to a time of heightened activity among university students. It really starts in the 1870s, probably carries on into the early 1900s. Through the influence of the YMCA and other organizations, student missionaries became increasingly common during this era. And it's interesting that the YMCA of this time had not been around for very long in the 1870s, 1880s, and it really did take its name seriously at the time. That C was very important, the Christian aspect of the YMCA, and they were noted for a variety of programs that encouraged faith and discipleship and evangelism and all those sorts of things. So don't just think of the YMCA as you may know it today with workout facilities, or the YMCA where you can get a good meal and do whatever you feel. It was much more than that at this particular time period. Well, ultimately, the Great Depression in the 1920s and then World War II in the 30s and 40s ultimately put a halt to the SVM. But for around 50 years, the stories were numerous of young men and young women who forsook promising futures and successful careers for a life of service and evangelism on the other side of the world. And most of them were going to China and to India, some to Africa as well. Well, among the noteworthy names that you will be reading about in this chapter are C.T. Studd, Studd. I always joke that his wife called him Muffin. He's a very interesting figure that you'll read about. You'll read about John Mott. You'll read about E. Stanley Jones, some folks who were major, significant missionary leaders in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and all of them in some way are connected with sort of this movement of college students who are going across the world. Well, while Studd was one of the first notable college students to leave a wealthy family in England and move to China first and then later to Africa, it's really John Mott who provided leadership in a broader capacity to the SVM. Mott spoke widely and encouraged involvement among the student groups that he talked to, and with his influence, thousands of college students committed themselves to a life of missionary service. During his time of leadership, the slogan of the SBM was the evangelization of the world in this generation. In many ways, it was an audacious goal to think that the world could be evangelized in this generation. I think it speaks to the optimism of the age and the hope that existed in progress sort of prior to World War I and World War II in particular. But it was the goal nonetheless, and as more and more was known about the world at this time, the knowledge of the need of the gospel became greater as well. Mott was also formative in helping to organize the Edinburgh Missionary Conference of 1910. There's a little bit of this in your reading, but it's worth noting that this was an interdenominational missionary conference, a gathering with over 1,300 missionary personnel who were serving across the world, across the globe. So there were, Hudson Taylor's folks there, China Inland Mission, but you've got Baptists and Methodists and Church of England and all sorts of folks who gather for this event. It was a celebration of what God had already done. There was a lot of anticipation of what God would continue to do. They're promoting the slogan of evangelizing the world in this generation, and so there was lots of hope that sort of surrounded this event. And this event becomes a building block for the later, broader ecumenical movement that will affect Western Europe and parts of the United States in the next decade or so. The 1920s, 1930s was when a lot of those organizations were being formed. And so Mott has an interesting role to play in those sorts of things as well. And we should note that even though many mainline denominations began to lose their missionary fervor around this time period, missions becomes less and less of a priority. Many college students of the era, nonetheless, were still drawn to the task of evangelizing those who had never heard the gospel. And we'll think a little bit more about college students when we get together next time.